In the last 2 years on Oklahoma Gardening, we've brought you a few short segments on roses, but we haven't brought you a complete show talking about the different classification and groups of roses, as well as their cultural requirements. Well, on today's show, we're going to dive into roses completely. We're here at the home of Don and Brenda Johnson in Sapulpa, and Don and Brenda are both consulting Rosarians and rose judges. Hello, Don. Welcome to our program.
Hi, Steve.
I look around, Don, and I see all of these different roses you guys have here on your property. How many different roses do you have?
We've got about 500, give or take a few. Basically all varieties, modern hybrid teas, Floribundas, miniatures, shrubs, and quite a few old garden roses, and one of our favorite groups of roses are the English or David Austin roses.
Okay, and how long have you guys been interested in growing roses?
We became addicted to roses about 12 years ago, and have been collecting and adding beds and roses ever since.
Okay, so you've had time to kind of do all the research and just really get right into the roses and their history and learn as much as you can. I'm sure you're still learning about roses.
Constantly learning. There's a rich literature in old garden roses and the evolution of the rose, and they're finding out more and more all the time, especially as genetic identification improves. So it's a fascinating area in addition to the beauty of the rose.
Okay, really interesting. So when it comes to the history of roses, I understand the Chinese were some of the first hybridizers.
In simplest terms, there were two main groups of roses in the world. The China roses, the roses of the Far East, which were once blooming, non-fragrant, rather fragile, not tolerant of cold at all. And then there was another group of roses, the old European roses, that grew primarily in Europe and to a certain extent in the Middle East. And it wasn't until the 1800s that there was a merger of the two, resulting in eventually what became the modern roses we know today.
Okay, well, we're certainly glad that merger happened, because we've got so many different roses, so many different colors, so many different types. And if you would, in the simplest way you can, will you explain for us some of the different classes, types, and some of the forms of the roses? Maybe starting down here with this beautiful vase full of roses.
Okay, well, we'll just start backwards with the modern roses. This collection of roses, these are in the class of hybrid teas. These are the most popular and widely and commonly grown roses. They're characterized by having a high center, a nice symmetrical spiral appearance when viewed from above, and a nice full pattern when viewed from the side.
It's a very elegant, formal rose.
Very formal, very elegant, widely available. Unfortunately, many of the new varieties are not quite as fragrant as the ones you remember your grandmother growing, but there are still some very fragrant varieties out there.
And you not only have hybrid teas, but there are also tea roses. Is that right?
The tea roses were in that group of roses from China, and they're rather fragile roses, but similar to the modern hybrid tea. There's a rather complex evolution that led up to the first hybrid tea, which is credited as occurring in 1867. So any rose that was introduced after 1867 is arbitrarily defined as a modern rose, and any rose that was introduced prior to 1867 is by definition, although very arbitrarily, an old garden rose.
Okay, and we see a lot of old garden roses around people's yards, old home sites. And these are roses, I guess, that bloom pretty much once, or there can be some roses, some of these old roses that do bloom more than just the spring show?
Fortunately, yes. Some of the most beautiful floriferous roses in the world are repeat blooming. They do have cycles. They don't repeat with the degree that the modern hybrid teas and Floribundas do, but they do have cycles of bloom throughout the year. We can give you specific examples for anybody that's interested.
Okay, so they do, some old roses do bloom more than once.
Yes, they certainly do.
Okay, well, moving on down the line here, what type of roses do we have in this vase?
Probably the next most common rose that's widely grown is the Floribunda. This is an example of the Floribunda. This particular variety is Nicole. The Floribundas tend to have a little bit smaller blooms than the hybrid teas. They tend to be less formal. As you can see, they're more open, although some have more of a hybrid tea form. As a group, the Floribundas are probably the most colorful and easy to grow roses, and are great for landscaping.
Okay, and you got a couple really nice ones right back here. Is that right?
Here are two Floribundas we'd highly recommend. This beautiful orange multicolor is called Living Easy.
That is spectacular.
And the beautiful bright yellow there is called Sun Sprite. These are both extremely hardy roses, easy to grow, and relatively disease resistant. These are first-year plants, and I think you can see they're very vigorous.
So Don, what's the next group of roses you've got to show us here?
Okay, these are examples of miniatures. These are easy to grow. They're healthy little roses. They're great to grow in small gardens, particularly for the elderly and people who don't have a lot of mobility. These can be grown even in pots on their patio. This red rose is called Miss Flippins. This is called Autumn Splendor, and this has an oddball name, Soroptimist International.
Okay, and all the miniature roses have smaller blooms, smaller leaves, and the plants are usually small, but there can be some that can grow quite large.
Yes, some of the plants will actually grow as climbers, but most are fairly small, anywhere from 18 inches to 36 inches high. A lot of fun to grow these roses. Very easy to grow.
Okay. I saw you had the red Cascade you said you had for just 1 year, and it's already up to about 5 feet tall.
Yeah, red Cascade is a red miniature that actually acts more like a rambler.
A rambler.
So
okay.
You can decorate a long fence with that particular rose.
Interesting. Which one do we have here, Don? What type of rose?
This is a polyantha. Unfortunately, it's not blooming, but you can see the characteristic. It has many, many buds, and a large mass of flowers will be produced by that stem.
A large cluster.
A large cluster.
Okay. All right. Well, right over here in this final vase, what types of roses do we have collected here?
One of my favorite roses, and one of my favorite groups of roses, are the English roses, or so-called David Austin roses. Mm-hmm. These were hybridized by a man named David Austin, an Englishman, who wanted to capture the wonderful fragrance and softness of the old world roses from Europe, which are once blooming, with the very repeat blooming modern roses.
Okay.
I may have misspoken earlier saying that the China roses were once blooming. In fact, they are the repeat blooming roses that have given us the repeat blooming in all modern roses.
Okay, so that genetic material has gone into
yeah, there's
making up a lot of these new
genetic
hybrids.
material from the early China roses and early European roses and all modern roses.
Okay, well that is fragrant. I mean, you can get a whiff of it.
This is said to have the fragrance of myrrh, and it is quite unique.
It's and they have so many petals, just loaded with those petals.
Very heavily petaled. This is another David Austin rose. This one is called Lilac Rose. Heavily petaled, intensely fragrant. The next Austin I'm going to show you is probably the most widely grown of all the Austins. It's Graham Thomas. It's this yellow, and it has sort of a first cousin called Golden Celebration. Both of these are sold in the garden centers as shrub roses, but they both grow like large climbers and need to be grown as such with some type of support, such as an arbor.
Okay. So if you buy a Graham Thomas, be prepared, it's going to get large.
In Oklahoma, it will grow as a climber.
Okay, and the David Austin English roses are a little bit more disease resistant than some of the other roses?
A little bit more.
A little bit more?
A little bit more.
Okay.
As a group, they're wonderful. There are probably 200 varieties now. Some of his earlier varieties remain the best. Would highly recommend anybody contact somebody in the area in which they're living to see which Austins do the best.
Good idea.
And how to grow them.
Okay.
Here we have a couple of shrubs that are actually what would be called classic shrubs. This is ballerina. This is a branch off a very large plant which we grow as a climber.
It has a large number of flowers. Just look at that inflorescence. It's huge.
Here is a similar rose called Lavender Dream, and a somewhat similar rose called Lida Rose,
Okay.
made famous by the famous song from the Music Man. These three roses all belong to a group known as hybrid musk, which is rather a part of a complex group as far as classification goes within the classic shrubs, but these are hybrid musks. As a group, these are wonderful landscape roses.
Okay, I can imagine with these huge inflorescences. So we have modern shrub roses and classic shrub roses. So interesting that all those ways the groups are divided. Well, sometimes we hear the term remontant when gardeners are talking about roses. Can you explain a little bit about what that term means?
Remontant just means repeat blooming. Some of the early repeat blooming roses acquired that term, and it's really not widely used now, but in the catalogs you will see the term remontant, which usually means it doesn't repeat very well.
Okay. Okay, so reblooming.
Reblooming.
Okay. Well, Don, when it comes to growing roses, we can obtain our roses in a number of ways, but usually at the nurseries they come in one or two packaging systems. Is that correct?
Yes. We would, as members of the Rose Society, would strongly discourage people from buying the packaged roses per se. I would stick to buying roses from a reputable nurseryman. You're probably going to get them in containers.
Like a landscape plant.
Like a landscape plant. The other way is to get them through the mail order houses, and they come bare root. Either of these ways of purchasing roses are good, but we strongly discourage the packaged,
wrapped,
so-called cigarette
sure.
wrap varieties. These are generally poorly cared for, and a lot of the large retailers really don't care for the roses when they get them in the spring, whereas your reputable nurseryman will.
Okay, and there's a little bit of a difference when it comes to bare root roses versus container grown roses?
Bare root roses, as opposed to the grafted roses, has become a big issue. Most of the roses you will purchase now are grafted or budded onto a very hardy understock from a rose that's hardier. When you purchase these, they take off very quickly. They're very hardy. The bare root rose, which is not grafted but simply started from cuttings,
sure.
When you purchase one of those, they're going to be slower to take off, but eventually most of them will catch up with their counterparts that are grafted.
Okay, so either container grown or the bare root.
Either is
okay.
very good. There are some advantages and disadvantages to each.
Okay. When it comes to putting the roses out in our landscape, can you tell us a little bit about site selection within the garden?
Okay, I'm glad you said site selection. That's the first thing you need to consider. You want to make sure that your rose is going to get a minimum of 6 hours a day of sun, ideally full sun.
Full sun. The more sun, the better.
The more sun, the better, unless you're fortunate enough to have some west late afternoon shade in the summertime.
Late shade.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like real estate, location, location, location. You want that rose to have plenty of sun. You want it to be well removed from any competing shrubs or trees. If you look at your tree, kind of get an idea where the drip line is.
Sure.
Make sure your rose bed is well beyond that.
Further out in the sun.
Further out in the sun and well away from those competing roots. The
Gotcha.
Roses hate competition, particularly the modern roses. The beds should be elevated. Roses love water, but not too much.
They got to have that oxygen.
They like to have, like people, regular small amounts of water.
Okay, so
And
well,
they don't
well,
like to get it all at once.
well-drained raised beds are a good idea, like you've got here.
Well-drained raised beds, we recommend at least 8 to 12 inches of elevation. The soil should be prepared in such a way that water flows through it freely, but not too freely. Soil is obviously a very important issue. The general recommendations on soil is a mixture of 1/3 topsoil, 1/3 compost, and 1/3 sand. The sand, 1/3 component, can be substituted with
Perlite.
perlite or other materials. The compost can be anything that's organic.
Okay.
It can be peat,
Animal
it can be
manures.
manures. If you have access to a horse barn,
Sure.
horse barn, you have liquid solid gold.
Absolutely. Wonderful stuff.
Wonderful stuff.
That organic matter goes a long way to holding that moisture, providing that oxygen, and providing that drainage. Some of the other things I guess we should probably talk about are the way roses are watered, and I noticed that you have a lot of drip irrigation in all of your beds, looks like it, and this is a good thing to have in your rose garden because it will help reduce some of the disease problems. Is that correct?
It's a very good way to water large quantities of roses. The best way is a hose
Sure.
that you can take directly to the plant and get a good idea of how much that particular plant requires. The drip system is great when you have large quantities because time-wise it's just not possible to go around to each individual rose. It's also a very economical way to water. It's
Okay.
very
Doesn't
conserving of water.
The wind and the evaporation.
Right.
And with the overhead watering, we sometimes get disease organisms splashed from plant to plant, I know. And when we think about disease on roses, of course, black spot is the #1 culprit here in Oklahoma. And we've got a neat example, or not a neat example, but a good teaching tool here in this example of black spot. And you can see that the leaves turn yellow here and they got the black spots. And probably the worst thing this does is to defoliate the plants. Is that right?
Yes. Black spot really is probably not going to kill your plant, but it will defoliate it and it will never really perform well.
Okay. And you have a spray program here that you use to keep the black spot to a minimum. Is that right?
Well, we use a fungicide that we apply every 2 weeks. We think it's important if you're going to grow more than just a few roses, and probably even if you have a few, to spray weekly or every other week with a good fungicide going by the directions the manufacturer recommends.
Okay. And you were telling me earlier about how some of the older roses may be a little less susceptible to black spot, but especially when you have a huge collection of roses, you can definitely get some more disease problems on those roses.
Roses in many ways are like people. The more people you bring together, the more disease is going to be around. So if you have a large number of roses, you have to be more concerned about diseases such as black spot.
Okay, but some of the other things you can do would be to maybe give a little bit of space between the plants so there's good air circulation.
Right. And overcrowding again promotes disease, just like in
people. Okay.
They need their space, they need air. Unfortunately, this is probably not the best example of giving plenty of space to a rose, but
you have a good spray program.
we have a good spray program.
And I guess the sanitation of collecting these leaves once they fall and bagging those up, don't put them in the compost.
Yes, the
will
spores,
help a lot.
the spores of the fungus are here, and if they're left on the ground, they're going to, under the right conditions, remain there and infect the plants all over.
Okay.
So.
Well, Don, real quick, when it comes to pruning roses, I know the bulk of the pruning we do in the very late winter, early spring before the growth comes on, but you do a type of pruning right after we've had a few hard frosts.
Yes. After we've had 2 good hard freezes, at that point we usually consider the roses as having been dormant.
Mm-hmm.
What we don't want to do is to stimulate new growth by pruning and then have a hard freeze come along and destroy the plant.
That tender growth.
So after a couple of hard freezes, and that usually works out to be somewhere in early to mid-December,
Mm-hmm.
we will cut back about waist high, and this is to keep the wind from damaging the rose.
Okay.
And then we reserve that main pruning for the springtime,
Okay.
sometime in March.
Okay. And also one other thing to do to protect the roses for the winter, especially the grafted roses, you have a technique that you also employ, is that correct?
Yes, we like to mound up some type of organic material, or it doesn't actually have to be organic, anything that will protect this bud union,
Mm-hmm.
about 8 or 10 inches, more if it's a particular tender variety. There are many of the modern roses really don't require that in our area.
Okay. Okay, but
It's a good idea to do it anyway.
okay, if you have one that's particularly
Yes.
cold sensitive, might go mounded up for that
Yes.
protection.
And again, if there are questions, there are people in the area that can answer these questions, can be contacted through the Tulsa Rose Society.
Okay, about hardiness. Okay, well, let's go take a look at some of the climbing roses.
Okay.
Well, Dawn, I know that the climbing roses are some of the favorites of gardeners everywhere. I know my grandfather used to grow climbing roses on his porch, and I was always fascinated by them. The climbers can also be a little misleading, because I know we have some of the miniature roses that could be climbers. We can also have hybrid tea climbers, is that correct?
Right.
Well, I noticed you have a very lovely red climbing rose on this support right here. Which one is that one?
That rose is Dortmund. It's a very hardy climber. Climbing roses is a bit of a misnomer, because no roses climb naturally. They have to be trained.
They don't have the tendrils or little suction
Right.
cups like some of our vines do.
Right. They have to be trained as they grow up. Well, once they get well established on an arbor, then they can kind of take care of themselves. But they do require pretty close attention to make sure they continue to climb.
Okay, and we can have some of the climbing roses that either bloom only in the spring, or we can have those that bloom through the year, like this one here, blooming in late fall here.
In general, the climbers do their most profuse blooming in the spring, and then you get some repeat bloom throughout the year. But the springtime is when you get the big show.
The big show.
And they are really showy.
Okay.
Climbers add a new dimension to your garden. They get the garden up off the ground.
Yeah.
They're great for landscaping.
Mm-hmm. Well, Don, I certainly appreciate all the information you've shared with us here today. Can you tell our viewers where they could get a little bit more information about roses?
Certainly. There are 2 rose societies in the state now, the Tulsa Rose Society and the Oklahoma City Rose Society. Within both of those societies are members called consulting Rosarians, who are more than happy to help people with their rose problems, any advice that we can give them. I know that Tulsa Rose Society has a website. It's tulsarosesociety.org.
Okay.
And there are links there to member services. The American Rose Society has an extensive website with links to almost anything you could want to know about roses, including locations where you could purchase them, equipment needed for growing roses. There are other websites on the internet. There's one called helpmefindroses.com. If a person is looking for some sort of an exotic rose, typically what happens is somebody remembers their great-grandmother grew a rose, and
Sure.
they want to get that rose, and oftentimes they're able to actually find it.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the American Rose Society, and I understand that there's a special event close to home that they're going to be participating in next year?
Next October,
2004.
Tulsa Rose Society in Tulsa will be hosting a national convention and rose show at the Adams Mark Hotel in Tulsa. This is really a big event. This is the first time a city the size of Tulsa has sponsored a show of this magnitude, and we're really looking forward to showing off Tulsa.
Okay, I bet you guys are really excited about it. Well, Don, I certainly appreciate all the information and the tour around your garden.
Okay.
We'll come back in the spring and we'll look at some individual named cultivars of these roses.
Okay, that'd be great.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.